So in the last episode, we talked about my hobby, which is mountain climbing. In this episode, we're going to talk about your hobby, which is money laundering. So how do you want to get started on this topic?
I'd like to get started by clarifying that I am not a hobbyist money launderer.
Oh, sorry, is it like semi-professional, professional? Is that what we... I didn't mean to patronize or talk down to you. As an expert in the field of money laundering, how do you get away with it?
You're going to get me sent to prison. I've never laundered money. I just worked in the finance sector for a few years.
That is what somebody who laundered money would say, though, right?
I guess it depends who they're talking to. Like, if you're selling money laundering as a service, you're not going to go, I've never laundered money.
You know what a Kafka trap is?
No?
A Kafka trap is where you set up a situation so that no matter what a person says, they sound guilty. So you would say something like, oh, alcoholics always deny it. And then either you admit to being an alcoholic or you deny it, thereby admitting.
Okay. Well.
It sounds like that when you say, you know, honestly, I've never been into money laundering. It's like that's what somebody who's really into money laundering would say.
I think it's interesting. I've never done it, and I would never have a reason to do it because I don't routinely do crime.
When I worked with the gaming industry, there was a guest lecture that was put on about money laundering, and this was 5 or 6 years ago, so it was very new to me. And I realized that I think that was the point in which I was first put on a list because I went to a lecture about money laundering, and I was the only person who took notes.
That's such a Holly move. I quite enjoy that, actually.
I go to a lecture to learn something. I'm going to take notes. As you well know, I have a terrible, terrible memory. I have a hilariously bad memory.
You do have a pretty terrible memory. Okay. I suppose we should start by defining what money laundering actually is for people who maybe aren't familiar with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so money laundering is the illegal processing of the proceeds of crime to disguise their origin. So you commit a crime. How do you then use the money that you've got from that crime without being picked up by the police?
The reason that this interests me is because, so I work in cybersecurity, right? In particular, offensive security with penetration testing. And very often people like to compare the work that we do as penetration testers with the actions of cyber criminals. And of course, that is the point in which we actually have no experience and it's just not a thing that we work on. So I will break into computers and then demonstrate those vulnerabilities to organizations, whereas an actual cyber criminal, breaking into the computer is just the first step, right? You've got a whole bunch of activity that is to come after that in terms of monetizing that attack and then getting that money into some form that you can actually spend it without being arrested, right? So we're going to focus in this episode on the back end side of that, right? It's like, hey, you have committed some kind of crime, maybe a cyber crime or maybe otherwise. How does getting that money into a usable form work? And of course, importantly, how come so many criminals are really bad at it and keep getting caught?
And then we're going to talk a little bit about cryptocurrency, which is Holly's favorite thing.
We'll talk a little bit about crypto. I do think crypto is important in these discussions.
Sorry. We're going to talk about cryptocurrency.
That's what I said, crypto.
No.
Like Doge, Ethereum.
No, Holly, crypto means cryptography.
Are you team Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash?
Neither.
Are you team proof of stake or proof of work?
Please stop.
Okay, we'll get to that. So you said we should define money laundering. And I think everybody kind of like implicitly knows what money laundering is, right? It's like that taking the money from the point in which you have stolen it to making it usable. But are there stages that are involved? Is there like common steps that an attacker would go through for money laundering, or is it different every time?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, there are 3 phases to money laundering, 3 steps. So the first stage would be placement, which is where you place or deposit the money into a financial system. The next stage is layering, where you create a complicated web of transactions or a trail of activities so that you can obscure the initial source or deposit. And then the third and final stage is integration, and that's when the funds are integrated into the economy, returned or accessible to the person who's been doing the laundering.
Okay, so you have some funds. Say, for example, we are talking about cybercrime and we're talking about the theft of cryptocurrency. So for example, you've hacked a cryptocurrency exchange, something like that, and when you first take the funds from their original wallet or source and you put it into a wallet that you control, that's placement, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you then mentioned layering and you described that as like a mixing activity, right? So several actions where you're trying to obfuscate the source. So you're trying to effectively put some logical distance between where the money was stolen from and when the money enters an account that you can use it from, right?
Yeah, so you're basically just trying to make that as complex as possible. And there are a few ways that you can do that, which we'll get onto.
This is the thing that has always confused me because very often you hear people misunderstanding cryptocurrency or generally misunderstanding the blockchain and those kinds of things. And one of my great frustrations is technologies like the blockchain, the feature that they bring is they are distributed. And, or I guess decentralized is a better term in this context. The blockchain is decentralized, and people hear that and think it means anonymous, right? Because the problem that I have in my head when we start a conversation about money laundering is if you steal some cryptocurrency from an exchange and then you move it through some wallets and then you put it into a wallet that you control, that you can withdraw into cash or some other form of fungible currency that you can exchange for goods and services, if you want to know where that money came from, right, you just look at the blockchain, right? It's a published source of this is all of the transactions that have taken place. So just moving it between one or two or three wallets that you've made doesn't sound like it's really hiding anything.
I guess having a public ledger where all of your transactions are recorded for all of time is probably not a great place to be laundering money. But there are online services and Bitcoin blenders and cryptocurrency tumblers and things like that that people use to swap a certain amount of cryptocurrency with somebody else. So I guess like the tokens. What am I trying to say right now?
Tokens, you can say tokens, yeah.
So you would be swapping an amount of cryptocurrency with somebody else, the same volume, I suppose, which would disguise more easily the source of those funds. But it does mean that that other person would potentially now have the cryptocurrency that you had that came from that criminal source initially.
So before we dive more into cryptocurrency and how it works, and I've got some notes on a recent money laundering story which went hilariously, should we talk about the basics or the foundations of how do we stop money laundering? So what is anti-money laundering?
So anti-money laundering is the name given to like collective legislation and regulation that requires banks and financial institutions to have process in place to for things like know your customer processes and to report suspicious transactions via suspicious activity reports if they suspect that somebody is involved in money laundering or in anything surrounding the proceeds of crime or terrorism financing and similar. So anti-money laundering is both a process and also collective of legislation.
So you mentioned know your customer. What is know your customer?
Know your customer is the requirement for banks and financial organizations to understand their customer, what usual behavior is for that customer, what are normal amounts of cash or volumes of cash to be moving in and out of their account. So their regular deposits that go into that account, how much do they earn, where do they live? To say if somebody's had, quite a low paid job for their entire life and then suddenly comes into a large volume of money, that would flag up. A fraud team would detect that and wonder where the source of that original money was. And also it requires a vetting process when you open an account with a bank or a finance institution. They'll have to sort of screen their prospective customers against a list of politically exposed people and make sure that they're not involved in like crime or terrorism financing and similar things. It's almost like a bit of a watch list, I suppose.
The know your customer stuff just sounds like the bank being aware of like what is normal for your account, right? So if you get paid by the same company every month, it's just like, oh, we don't need to investigate this transaction because it's just a normal activity for this user. And then anytime you get abnormal activity, so like a large deposit you use the term volume there, so I presume you're talking about not necessarily a large deposit, but maybe just a large number of transactions. It's just them being able to pick up on that as potentially suspicious, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. The first being if you've had an account with a bank for 10 years, but you've hardly ever used it, and suddenly you start using that really heavily, that looks suspicious. And secondly, know your customer also links to things like detecting modern slavery and people trafficking. If somebody comes into a bank and they're potentially being scammed or being taken advantage of, or you have it with foreign nationals where they'll sometimes go in to open a bank account or withdraw some money and someone else is with them and has their passport, for example, that could be evidence or a sign that they're being coerced.
Oh, so it's not only like bank account activity, but it's like behavior when interacting with the financial institution.
Yeah, absolutely. So an interesting thing is, as a consultant who works in a bank, or a teller, whatever you call them, wherever you are, you're required in the UK to report any suspicious activity. So even if you don't have hard evidence that somebody is laundering money or that something criminal is occurring, you still have to submit a suspicious activity report so that that can be investigated by, say, the police. Or the National Crime Agency, who sometimes work in conjunction with police forces. What that means is usually if you submit a suspicious activity report, the fraud team at a bank will freeze somebody's accounts, which means that they're not able to transact. They can't access any money that they might have deposited. They can't withdraw any money, things like that. But you're also not allowed to tell the customer why that's happened, because that constitutes tipping them off, which makes you an accomplice.
So you can say if somebody goes into a bank, talks to a teller, and the teller thinks it's suspicious, they could say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we're not able to serve you at this time." But they can't say, "Oh, hey, dude, you got a fraud warning on your account, so like, can't give you any money today. You know, you probably should check into that." Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, basically.
It just says call FBI on your account notes. Like,
they can say anything really, I suppose. They could tell them that there's a hold code on the account, but they couldn't tell them why. But I think even if you act in a way that gives the customer or the person attempting to launder the funds the impression that they're being investigated for fraud,
yeah.
You can be fined or you can go to prison for that.
So you can't tip them off. And this is interesting because we were talking the other day, weren't we, when we were doing the show notes and things for this episode. And I told you that, so I do all of my banking through a mobile application. And on the mobile app for my bank, it doesn't have any of the details that I would expect to be like KYC details, right? So like this know your customer thing, knowing who you're employed by, how long you've been employed, what your income is, those kinds of things. Like these details that I would expect my bank to know so that it can tell if a transaction is unexpected or unusual. On my banking app, there are none of those details. There is a space where those details are supposed to be, but when I log in, occupation, unknown, employer, unknown, start date, the 1st of January 2010, that definitely feels like a null value, doesn't it? Just like the drop down starts there or something. Income frequency, unknown. Income, unknown. Home address. Country of residence, unknown. Country of birth, unknown. Town or city of birth, unknown. This is my actual bank account.
Maybe you're just really good at OPSEC.
So the really funny thing was, a little while ago, my bank rang me in what was, at the time, somewhat of a suspicious phone call when your bank, like in inverted commas here, is like, your bank rings you up and says, "Hey, there's a problem with your bank account. We need some details about you, like your name, your address, all of these things." Like you immediately think phishing. And then you do the thing where you're like, okay, what is the steps for validating this here? And I think that's one of those activities where some people can get caught out. There used to be a problem, I'm told, with landline phones where a scammer would call you up on the landline. They would tell you there's some problem with your account, whatever, and say, "Oh, for security reasons, you should hang up now, and then you should call your bank, or you should call whatever company says there's a scam alert on your account." And, you thank the person for the call, you would hang up, you pick the phone back up, you dial the number, you speak to your bank. But what would happen is the scammers wouldn't hang up the line at their end. And on some landline systems, that wouldn't disconnect the call. So when you start pressing buttons on your phone, it's just sending the tones, but the line hasn't been disconnected. So you're still talking to the scammer. And I saw this recently. In fact, you shared this with me on Twitter, didn't you? Somebody who got scammed, an NFT scam, where their mobile phone rang and the call ID, which, by the way, if you didn't know, call ID can be easily spoofed. Call ID on their mobile phone said it was from Apple Inc. So they trusted them. I'm missing a couple of steps here, but they trusted them because the phone in part said it was a legitimate call from Apple. So yeah, the scammers are everywhere. And my bank rings me up and says, "Hey, we need to validate some personal details." And it was those kinds of details that they needed to validate. Which makes it even weirder that my account still does not have those details showing on my account.
Yeah, it's very strange that they've not tried to capture those at any point if you use that regularly, or if you've spoken to anyone in a contact center or gone into a branch, they would try and collect that data while you're there for that exact purpose. But it depends how long you've had the account, really, because if you had that account, say, when you were a child, or you had it prior to the introduction of some of this legislation, then they wouldn't have collected that data at the time. There would have been no obligation for them to do those things.
I've had the account for something in the region of 19 years.
It's quite a while.
Yeah, it's a little while. And I remember I've had some interesting problems with my bank. But one of them being I did open the account when I was what they call a young person, so a child. I don't remember exactly how old I was. And when you get to 18, obviously the details of your account change because you're now legally eligible for credits. You can have an overdraft and things like that. And on a young person's account, you can't have any of those things. So it's supposed to be when you turn 18, the account just ticks over and becomes an adult account. Or what I think they just call it a current account as opposed to a young person's account. Like none of those things worked. I remember back when I turned 18, it just didn't happen. And I had to go into the branch and be like, hey, it still hasn't done this thing. So I've had some funny issues with my bank over the time. But yeah, that one made me laugh where we're kind of preparing to have this discussion about know your customer. And I'm like, oh, I'll see what information my bank holds about me. And it's like, apparently none. Apparently no information.
Yeah, it's really interesting now because when you try and open a bank account online or anything like that, they'll take you through an electronic ID check. So you'll need to provide like a scan or something similar of potentially a utility bill or another piece of correspondence from like an official body, a copy of at least one piece of government issued ID, potentially two, depending on what kind of account it is and who you're opening that with. And then they'll also check to see if you're on the electoral roll for where you live as well. So if you're trying to open a bank account in London, but you actually live in Scotland, that might raise some alarm bells. And often for, say, an ISA, a savings account, for tax purposes, they'll need things like your national insurance number. If you're not registered to vote where you say you're opening the account or where you live, you will fail the electronic ID check for opening that account.
I also had this recently. So I did open an account with a challenger bank just to see how different that is. I mean, based on the competence of my actual bank, it's a really, really low bar. So I thought maybe a challenge bank would be worth investigating. But also more recently, I opened an account on a crypto exchange. And they have very similar kind of KYC processes. And with it being all mobile app based, you install the app, but when you go to open your account, take a photograph of your driving license. You have to take a selfie holding your driving license and things like that. I think if I remember correctly, to open the bank account, I had to take a video, but to open the crypto account, it was just a selfie with me holding my ID.
I've done that before, and I always think it's so funny because it's like a hostage situation. Or you have a hostage holding a newspaper. It's like it feels like that.
It's just like how much duress can you appear to be under? Like looking in the corner. I am trying to open an account. I am not under duress, and see how much suspicion you can raise whilst doing that. Anyway, I tried to open this crypto account, and the verification failed. Now I mentioned this, I think, in a previous episode. I've had this recently where my driving license is the new style of driving license, and some of these systems don't recognize it because it looks slightly different. So it may have just been that. I had it with my exams, and I opened the crypto account at about the same time, so it could have just been that. But I just kept trying, and on like the third or fourth attempt, it just worked. So that makes me feel like, maybe there is a machine learning artificial intelligence system that's verifying these photographs. Or maybe it's just a PRNG and it just rolls a dice, and if you get a 6, you can open an account. And I obviously didn't roll a 6 on the first 3 attempts, but I got there in the end.
Statistically, you're going to brute force it in the end, is what you're saying.
Well, it gave me no other option. So it just, on the mobile app, it just said failed. And then a couple of minutes later, I got an email. And the email basically just said, sorry that we couldn't verify you. Please try again. There was no contact us here or make sure that, some of the details you might expect, like make sure you're in good lighting, make sure that the ID is clearly visible, or any of those kind of details you might expect to assist a customer through. As far as I remember, it was just that didn't work, try again. So I did just keep trying again, and then it let me through in the end.
Amazing.
And that's where truly I put all of my Doge.
Oh, why? are you doing? What? Why?
Why Doge?
What? No,
Because
why
it's
did
going
you
to the
do this to
moon.
me?
Rocket emoji.
Oh, for God's sake.
Ironically, I can't log into my crypto exchange because it says I need to verify my ID.
Again?
Yeah, I've got to do it every 7 days or something. It's not the full process, just like I can log in with Face ID, but then there is an absolute timeout. I think it's 7 days. And then Face ID stops working and I've got to log in with a password.
That seems excessive.
So the way that it works, I open the app. So obviously my phone has to be unlocked. I unlock my phone first. I open the app. It uses Face ID to log me into my account. But then about every 7 days, it will log me out completely. And then I have to enter my password and it will text me a PIN number. I would much prefer it just uses Face ID.
Actually, now that you mention it, my current pension provider, where I work at the moment, they have an app and it's atrocious. You can't just use biometrics whenever you want to log in. It doesn't ask you for permanent permission. You have to, it redirects you to a browser to log into the website and then authenticates the app using that. And that'll only last for a certain period of time, I suppose, because I don't check my pension account with any great regularity every couple of months or so. So maybe it's just a period of time that it expires. But I always thought that it was just a terrible app because I have to repeatedly log into the browser even though it's given permission to use Face ID.
It's annoying, isn't it?
Very annoying. Bad customer experience.
Just going to buy a couple of Doge whilst we're here.
Why?
Cool. So we've talked about like what KYC is supposed to be. This know your customer aspect of like knowing details of who the person is, maybe who they're employed by, the sources of the funding, and then also like something around activity. I've also seen previously as well artificial intelligence and machine learning being used within payment systems to just better detect what activity is maybe suspicious. Because you mentioned earlier, didn't you, like this difference between like a large deposit and then a large number of deposits either could be suspicious depending on context. I've seen AI and ML being used to determine whether activity is unusual or not. That seems infallible. Machine learning seems a good fit to that problem. Can you imagine any problems with that?
Absolutely not. No, it seems like a perfect fit. I think that, to be honest, if there's one thing that people do as rational agents, it is figuring out what the rules are and circumventing them when it serves them.
I imagine this is one of the reasons why tipping off a potential money launderer is bad, because not only could they take action to evade prosecution or maybe flee, but also like if they perform an action and then you tell them, hey, this thing that you did, that was suspicious, it's like they might stop doing that in the future and make an investigation more difficult, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention on the machine learning thing, though, the reason that I'm being mean about this is because in a prior episode, I mentioned this story of the Americans trying to detect Russian missile silos by feeding in images, and the story goes that the data set that they used was bad, and the machine learning algorithm optimized for a different problem than the problem they wanted to solve. And I recently saw some articles of this being used for COVID research and for using machine learning to detect based on images, so scans of patients, chest scans of patients, whether that patient was COVID positive or not. And again, it was just another really good example of machine learning being really good for some problems and not so much for others. A good example of this being the images that were fed into the system. Some of the patients were sitting up and some of them were lying down. The reason for this was the patients who were scanned lying down were COVID positive and were seriously ill. That was why they were lying down. And so this particular machine learning algorithm learned to detect whether the patient was lying down or not to detect whether they were COVID positive or not. Another example being the data set was bad and it contained images, chest scans of children who did not have COVID. And then the obviously test set was just a mix. And the AI learned to identify children, not COVID. So yeah, machine learning again being absolutely fantastic, but not necessarily fantastic at the thing you want it to be.
It's like that Batman quote, isn't it? It's what you deserve, but not what you need right now.
This is like the Shakespeare thing, I swear.
What Shakespeare
I'm over
thing?
here on a technology podcast saying, here are some really interesting applications of machine learning. And then Morgan's over here, like, reminds me of Batman.
Batman's really cool. I don't know if it's the third one where is it Lucian Fox?
It's like the first three were really popular, and then like the second three, the prequels weren't so good, right? Because they introduced.
Okay, I'm talking about I'm talking about the Christopher Nolan trilogy. So Dark Knight Rises, I think it is Morgan Freeman's character has built this system, and it's like mass surveillance. It uses people's phones to track like location and like detect crime and where that's occurring in this city with like microphones and stuff. And then he shuts it all down at the end because he thinks that nobody should have that much power, which I think is really cute and utopian.
Robin, I am your father.
Cool. Okay. So, yeah, there's lots of legislation around this. Some of it's pretty cool, some of it's not so cool.
What makes it not so cool? Can you give us some
personal bias? I don't really like 500-page documents that, you know, say what you could say in like 30 pages.
Oh, it's just a general some regulation is not well written. No, I can get down with that. I can.
But interestingly, like it features in some other areas too. So part 3 of the Terrorism Act, which I think was written around 2000, makes it illegal to use, possess, or raise funds to finance terrorism or to form an agreement to do that. So all they have to do is find evidence that you've agreed to fund a terrorist organization and you're in contravention of that. You don't even have to have actually successfully laundered the money.
Yeah, this is like the US idea of conspiracy, right? Where you have to have planned an activity and then taken a step towards that activity. You don't necessarily have to have been successful in it. I'm not a lawyer, we should probably point this out, but yeah, I remember reading the Terrorism Act having an interesting clause in there where, distinct from things like Computer Misuse Act, where the Computer Misuse Act is all about, you know, unauthorized access to a computer program or data. So the implication there is it must have been, you must have achieved it. Whereas with the Terrorism Act, it's worded differently and it's a seriously planned attack. The attack doesn't have to have been successful, it just has to have been seriously planned.
Yeah, I think that's an important provision. Maybe we need some examples, ways of laundering money to contextualize.
That is not where I thought you were going with that. Well, I thought you were going to say, oh, I think we should have some examples. Like, is there any, you know, court cases, case law about like money laundering or like the prosecution of money laundering that we can talk about? And you're all over here like, yeah, so we should probably finish this episode by telling people how to get away with it. Is that where you're going?
Who's finishing the episode? We're like 20 minutes in. I'm absolutely not finishing the episode
I
right now.
presume that money laundering is quite difficult. I just thought it would take you a while to get out the, like, you know, if I was going to do it, this is how I would do it story.
No, I just think it's interesting to look at ways that this has been done historically, and then we can look at the example that you mentioned earlier, because I think you got some interesting notes on that.
Interesting is carrying a lot of weight there. I'm excited.
I'm also excited. Yeah, so some ways of laundering money then. I'm going to let you cover the first one due to the fact that it is called smurfing.
I'm not familiar with smurfing.
Are you not?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
Am I?
Okay, I thought we discussed this previously. It's where you deposit it in really tiny amounts.
So I would call that structuring. I've not heard the term smurfing for that.
Oh.
So structuring to me is when you hear that, I think it's fairly well known that there is a limit after which a transaction has to be reported, right? So in the US, you hear people very often saying, if you deposit more than $10,000, you have to report that. And then everybody thinks they're really clever because they go, haha, I'll just deposit $9,999 and I'll just keep doing that. And it's like, yeah, but they're looking out for that as well. And that activity I would know is structuring. I've never heard it referred to as smurfing, though. Is smurfing a specific kind of structuring, or is it just a different name for the same thing?
It's pretty much the same thing, yeah. It's just another name for it, which I thought that you would enjoy, actually. So I'm surprised you hadn't found that. I
do enjoy that term. I do.
Yeah. And also, interesting, on things like Monzo, where you've got like a challenger bank, if you go into the app, it will give you limits for a specific period of time. So if you plan on flying under the transaction limit radar and saying, actually, I'll just deposit £9,999 or
I've got a
dollars.
good story for this that probably won't make it into the podcast, but a little while ago I went out and bought a car, and the way that this worked was I went into the dealership.
Which car is this?
This is the Duke. So I went into the dealership and it's like, hi, can I have that car but in white, please? And so I, being a millennial, have no idea how like large money transactions works, right? Because I've like never put a deposit down in a house or something like that. Owning a house is just something that is an alien concept to me. My parents did it, but I don't really understand how it would ever financially work in this economy. But I did go in and I bought a car. And when I buy everything else, it's just Apple Pay, right? Don't I just like rub my phone on your payment machine or whatever? And they were like, oh, we can take debit. That's cool. So I bought the car with my Monzo card. And then I went, they gave me the keys. They were like, thanks for your business. I went outside and I sat in my car, and obviously I needed to insure the car before I could drive it home. So I sat in the car, I rang my insurance company, I'd had a quote ready and everything like that. I had the number, just had to ring the guy up and pay for the insurance because I had bought the car. I rang the guy up, my card wouldn't go through, I'd hit my daily payment limit. So I now owned a car that was just parked in the garage's car park that I couldn't legally drive. And then you start doing that, like, what do I do? Like, I don't have another bank account. I'm just like, what do I do? What do I do? And
that was both a rookie move on your part, an oversight on Monzo's part, and also I would expect the garage to give you like drive away insurance at least, so that you could do the paperwork at home.
They probably would have, and maybe that is a standard thing, and I just wasn't aware of it, because the guy, like, they run you through all of these things, have you considered insurance? Do you have this? Do you have that? Breakdown, all of those things, because I'm sure there's upsells and includes that they can add. And when he said insurance, I was just like, yeah, like, I've got it covered, don't worry. I've got my quote number with me and stuff like that. And then anyway, I just rang a friend and I was like, hey, can I borrow £70? But I need you to give me your debit card number over the phone, and then I'm going to ring this guy. And the insurance company, when we worked out that this was happening, and I'm on the phone to the insurance company and my card won't go through, I said to the guy, I was like, I'm really, really sorry. I don't know what to do. Let me ring a friend and see if he can help me. I've obviously like fallen into a mistake here that I wasn't expecting, so I don't have another bank card or anything I can use. Like I've got a credit card, but I didn't have my credit card with me, so I didn't know the number. Like I couldn't, I did have another card, I just didn't have it on me. So I was like, oh, I'm just going to ring a friend and see if he can help me. And the insurance company guy was just like, oh yeah, don't worry, I'll just wait. And he just sat on hold. Like I put the insurance company on hold for like however long it took me to ring a friend, explain to them that, well, essentially without explanation, I need £70 and also the number from your bank card. And got back on the phone to the insurance company and I was like, yeah, I've got it, don't worry. And then that went through. And we're talking suspicious transactions.
That is such a Holly story.
The guy's like, yeah. Is it the same number on this bank card? I'm like, no, I've just told you. I've just rang a random person up and said, hey, I need some money.
I'm not even sure how they're allowed to do that. That's wild. That's such a Holly story.
Yeah, I remember saying, there was something like, can you not just do a direct debit, right? Can you not just... Because I pay my car insurance by direct debit usually, but there's some like... deposit or the first transaction has to be by debit or something like that. I guess for the insurance to be active from right now, you have to presumably pay an amount. But yeah, I had to pay on debit and I couldn't because I'd hit my limit.
So that's the advice, kids. If you wanna make a large transaction, hit your limit. That's it for 30 days.
It's daily limit.
You ever? I don't want to ask how much your car was. But it's also a very Holly move.
Well, everybody now knows how much my car was because they'll just look at what the daily limit on Monzo is.
Well, I don't know what else you bought that day. You might have spent like £100 on snacks before you bought the car.
It's one of my weird car buying stories. So structuring then is the activity of a series of smaller deposits to try and mask the fact that you really are making a larger deposit. Are there any other kinds of named activities?
Yeah. So something that commonly impacts students, vulnerable people, and in cities typically is money muling. So that's where you would ask either potentially someone that you know or a complete stranger to allow you to use their bank account, ironically. Temporarily, they'll say, something like, can I put £5,000 in your bank account? I'll let you keep like £500 if you let me do this, transfer 5,000 in and then ask them to transfer 4.5 out or something like that to another account. It's part of like the layering phase, so creating like that web of transactions to obscure the initial deposit. If it passes through what are considered to be legitimate bank accounts, then it's less likely to be considered suspicious by bank accounts, provided that that is usual activity for that person. So bank accounts may or may not have like a fraud engine that would flag up a large transaction into a student's account, for example, because they get paid a few £1,000s from student finance every few months. So potentially large transactions wouldn't flag up on their system.
I presume there's quite a lot of data there. Like, I presume the banks know who student finance is, right? And they can tell if this isn't the sender is a known account used by student finance and it's at the right time of the year and all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, so some banks are really good at that and some just aren't. Some haven't historically invested in like a financial crime team or in the technology that they need to detect those sorts of things. But it's quite data rich. So there was actually an example a few years back that was really cool. Monzo detected that Ticketmaster had been breached before Ticketmaster knew, because a lot of people who had previously made a purchase on their Monzo accounts to Ticketmaster were victims of fraud. So they basically aggregated all of the transaction data for the people who were being impacted by fraud, and Ticketmaster was like the underlying factor. So they reported it to Ticketmaster, who said, oh no, like this isn't true, we haven't been breached, and then discovered later that they actually had. But Monzo had already taken steps to prevent any further transactions across the board to like all of their customers to the people who were committing the crime.
Yeah, this is something that I've known about for a while, actually, which is an interesting statistic when it comes to the statistics behind how are breaches detected. Because I think very often people think that breaches are detected by internal security teams, internal systems administrators, and those kinds of things. And they are, that happens. You know, there's examples out there of like a sysadmin looking through a log file to fix an unrelated bug and detecting suspicious activity or something like that, or an organization paying for an intrusion prevention system or an intrusion detection system that is successful in detecting the activity of data exfiltration or something like that. But a huge number of breaches are actually detected, as you say, by financial organizations when they see that a large number of accounts are tied to fraud activity and also there is a single point of commerce. So it's like, oh, all of these accounts, there is fraud activity and we know they all shopped at the same store. It's surprising, if you've not looked into it, how frequently actually breaches are detected by third parties.
Yeah, and for anybody who wants to read more about that particular case, Monzo actually wrote a blog about the Ticketmaster case. So you can check that out on their website.
We'll link it in the show notes.
So we've covered smurfing, structuring, money mules. There's also things like blending, where you use a cash-heavy business. And this is something that you see actually on Breaking Bad. So there's, I think it's Gus, who runs the chicken places. He uses restaurants that are quite cash-heavy businesses to blend the proceeds of his like side hustle in dealing methamphetamines. And then is it? I don't know if it's Better Call Saul or Saul tries to help Walter and Jesse with laundering their money by opening a chain of like nail salons or something like that, because they're cash heavy businesses. So it's more difficult to trace the transactions and the source of those funds. You could just say, we've done X amount of business, and potentially pay variable prices for the goods that you need in order to provide that service. And I think there's one of these in every town. There's a restaurant that never does any business. Like, it's always empty every time you walk past, but it seems to do really well, and it's open for years and years. Doesn't even do takeout. Like, how is it still running?
I think one of the things there as well is the business doesn't necessarily have to be like completely dead. There's definitely no doubt examples of that where there's just like, that business never seems to do any business, but it's still here. But it could also be that you have a catch-rich business that is seen to being busy, but it's actually recording like disproportionately high profits. So something like a car wash where you do see cars coming and going, everybody's paying in cash, but they're, you know, supposedly washing 50 cars an hour when in actuality they have capacity for 5 and things like that.
Casinos have done things like this before as well. There's been certain cases where casinos have been involved in money laundering. Again, quite cash rich. And I think it would be difficult to be an accountant at a casino, personally. So one of the other examples that's, I think, when you think about it, it makes so much sense. It's things like, oh, maybe in like Bad Boys or another nondescript crime movie, trade-based. There's usually like some, because they're narcotics police, there's usually some high-profile South American drug dealer who's like trafficking cocaine or something. And he has like stacks and stacks of cash in the attic that's like being eaten by rats or something like that he needs to launder. And there are various ways that they do this, but something historically that has been picked up is trade-based money laundering. So where you'll pay, like you said previously, a disproportionately high amount for something like a piece of art.
Oh, yeah.
That might be, they'll sell it for millions, and it's definitely not worth that much, but it's like a cover so that they can then have a legitimate transaction. They don't have to launder the money afterwards. There are taxes and things associated with that, depending on where you live.
Related activities as well. So things like buying wine and then claiming that the wine was consumed and things like that as a means of hiding money leaving an account.
How would that work? What do you mean?
If you want to, for example, move a large amount of money between countries and you can only travel through an airport with a certain amount, so say you're not allowed to travel with more than $10,000 in cash, you can purchase very, very expensive vintage wines, travel with those because they're not viewed in the same way. The limits might not be picked up in the same way as literally traveling through an airport with a bag of cash. When you get to the far side, you could sell the wine, and therefore you have successfully transferred currency from one nation to another. But on your records, you could just claim that you consumed it, and then that money disappears from the system.
Of course. Okay. Yeah. That's another thing that people do commonly is they'll try and transfer cash from one geographical area to another that has more lax money laundering regulation and anti-money laundering regulation.
Sometimes also just as well, like the criminals might physically be located in a different territory to where they steal the money from, right? I mean, steal the money from an organization in the UK, and if you're based in, Eastern Europe, Russia, some of the territory like that, like there might be this international transfer hurdle that you have to get over just because of where the attacker is physically located.
That opens you up to more risk because depending on where you're doing the crime and where you're doing the laundering, you're potentially exposing yourself twice to two different investigatory powers and different pieces of legislation that could catch you out there. So there was quite a high-profile case in 2019 where a banker from Azerbaijan went to prison after he failed to explain the source of his income when the National Crime Agency served him with an unexplained wealth order. Now, in an attempt to get his wife to admit to what they suspected, which was that he'd embezzled the money from the bank he'd worked at, they also issued her with an unexplained wealth order because of their shared assets. And her defense was quite funny. It was basically, there are couples that live under the same roof who don't speak to each other, and he's actually in custody at the minute, so I'm not sure what use you expect me to be. But she had effectively been spending, on average, £4,000 a day at Harrods for over 10 years. She had like over 50 credit cards, really expensive jewelry. So she had a £1.1 million Cartier ring. The couple owned a property in Knightsbridge. They owned a golf course. So really not subtle on the money laundering front. Where did all of this money come from? How can you afford to live like this when you have no income or no legitimate income?
That's one of the things that often comes up with like those major criminals, isn't it? This idea that you get caught out on tax evasion as opposed to the actual crimes that you're committing, because potentially it's easier to prosecute based on that, where it's like, hey, you have this money and you can't show that you've paid tax on it. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that very often comes up when you read the stories of criminals getting caught, is these unexplained money orders, right? Where it's just like somebody allegedly like works in the post office or works in the corner shop or something like that, but then drives a Jaguar.
Yeah, it's literally that.
A lot of people would claim, like, if you were to talk to them about, like, hey, if you're a successful criminal, how would you get away with it? Like, oh, I'd never spend past my means and I would hide the money and those kinds of things. And as soon as it actually happens, they're all like, I bought a Lamborghini. Like, don't you work in the post office?
Yeah, no, it is that. And that also, interestingly, if there is somebody committing fraud who works in the finance sector, that's how they typically get caught, because they'll do training, mandatory training for everybody in the organization. So I've done it a few times. Even if you work in a completely unrelated back office function and you don't serve customers and you don't interact with the teams that serve customers, you need to notice. You need to notice and report if someone starts coming to work suddenly with like expensive designer handbags, or they're going on holiday all the time to like luxury destinations that you don't think that they could afford based on what they are probably earning, and you're obliged to report that internally. So there's usually a nominated money laundering lead, like a financial crime officer or similar, that handles those kinds of reports. But I think the limit for that, the lower limit, is it has to be at least £50,000, according to the legislation, before an unexplained wealth order can be considered. And they typically don't pursue it in cases where it's low amounts, because it's not a good use of like court time.
Yeah, or like a single thing, right? It's like maybe a family member died or something and you've paid for a holiday. Like those things happen. So we're not just talking about like, yeah, we went down the pub and he bought one extra round than anyone else. You know, he seemed a bit loose with his capital. No, it's like either a significant amount or a significant number.
Yeah.
I give you an example where this could occur that might be seen as unfair to some people. Very often when you talk to like founders of companies and things like that, and I'm not necessarily talking about like founders of like VC-backed startups and those kinds of things. I just mean people who went from having a job to being self-employed. Maybe they do crafts on the side, they open an Etsy store, and then eventually over time that becomes their job. Very, very often when you talk to people about like, when did you make the leap kind of thing? Like, when did you think this job might be able to support you? And I think a lot of people, like, it has to be pretty long term and it has to be quite a lot of money, you know. If not matching your salary, then at least demonstrating that it has the potential to match your salary before you would make that jump to being self-employed. And that is a perfectly legitimate way that somebody might have a bit more money than you'd expect them to, you know, because they're making money through another gig, like through a side project or a new company that they might not necessarily talk about at work. And I think this might be strange to some people because they would think, well, if you're opening a craft store, you're obviously crafts passionate. You would talk to everybody about that, right? And you might talk to friends and family about that because that's something you're really into and you've got this goal, you want to be self-employed. But one thing that I would say is, for most people, not a great idea is telling the people that you work with that you're intending on leaving.
But also on the flip side of that, that is perfectly explainable. So if somebody were to contact a whistleblowing hotline or report you to their anti-money laundering officer, nominated person, whatever, you could demonstrate really easy. You could say like, I have a side hustle. I have an Etsy or something. Like, here's my Etsy profile. Yeah. What we're talking about is where people have millions in undisclosed illegitimate income, and then they're splashing that in like Harvey Nichols on like Chloe handbags and stuff. It's really obvious. It sticks out.
Yeah, I was just giving an example of where, like, one of the reasons why they might not investigate every single time somebody spends outside their means is that, like, people might have money that you don't know about, and that is entirely legitimate.
Yeah. And also on the flip side, in some organizations, especially in the finance sector, and I think in certain government organizations too, the credit checking and fraud checking and stuff and sanctions checking that you have to go through to get the job is pretty robust. So you need typically slightly more references than you're going to work somewhere else. So I think the standard is about 2 years of work history. Some finance organizations will ask for 3 or 5 years of references instead, depending. So I guess a bit more similar to if you're applying for like security clearance rather than a standard job. And then they'll do fraud, DBS, sanctions checking to make sure that you're not affiliated with crime and you haven't previously been prosecuted for fraud. They'll check what your credit score is to see if you've potentially got a bit of a gambling problem or if you don't pay your bills on time, because that puts them in an exposed position where if you're serving customers or you have access to accounts, you're likely to commit fraud.
Here's something that comes up on my background checks that you're aware of, and it's a purely human thing because a computer wouldn't care, but it catches humans out. I once lived in an apartment and it was fantastic, and then I decided to move closer to work. So I left that apartment and moved to an apartment that was closer to work that I hated and was awful. And a year or two later, I moved back. I didn't move back into the exact same apartment, but I moved into the same building. It was effectively next door. So, you know, you could imagine me for 2 years living in apartment 19, moving away for a year, and then moving back into apartment 20. And it's there's a completely sensible story behind it, and it was just because the other location, the other apartment was way nicer area, way bigger apartment, those kinds of things. But it's a thing that stumbles humans, where they look down your address history and they're like, that's weird. It's not that weird, really. Like,
Yeah, I don't think it's that weird. Like, having been to both of those apartment
yeah,
complexes, one of them, well, they're both pretty cute. I like both of them, but one of them is definitely like,
it was way nicer. Yeah.
yeah.
We're not talking like a studio apartment versus a mansion here. I'm just saying, like, one of them was a bit nicer than the other one. I moved,
Yeah.
regretted the decision, so moved back. But that does come up on, when you've got to demonstrate your address history and things like that, it comes up on that, but only ever with people when they notice that the numbers are next to each other.
You do move a lot though, so I imagine that raises
I'm
flags.
agile.
You're one of those people like agile. Move quickly and break stuff. Cool. I think that's about all of the immediate historic examples that I've got. There are other things like you can use gift cards, you can use in-game currency and rare items on the likes of World of Warcraft. You could buy like a super rare item, sell it on eBay.
Real money transactions within video games, so things like Entropia Universe that has real money transactions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much a good summary so far of, like, money laundering is the attempt to obfuscate the source of illegitimately gained funds, and anti-money laundering is investigators attempting to prevent that. And also, anytime you think you've come up with a really cool new way of doing money laundering, you haven't. They have already thought of that. You're not as clever as you think you are.
Yeah,
like this whole
it's
idea
been
of,
done.
Yeah, this whole idea of like, no, I'll just put in loads of small transactions. Yes, that has a name. It is structuring.
It's just the funniest one for me, I think, is like trying to blend trade-based money laundering of like high-priced art with the blockchain and creating some mangled NFT thing. I hate it.
You know the story of the first tweet, right? The first tweet NFT.
I saw that. Yeah, it was ridiculous. And it's especially funny that they tried to offload that after Jack had resigned from Twitter.
Were they offloading it because Jack left, or are they offloading it because Elon arrived? Yeah, for those who don't know that story, there was an NFT made of the first tweet. It was sold for the ridiculous figure of $2.9 million. And then recently it went up for auction, and it did not do very well at auction.
It's almost like people are realizing that there's no legitimate purpose for NFTs outside of having a hexagonal profile picture on Twitter and looking like a dweeb. You can cut that if you want to.
I think for your benefit, I might cut that. We'll see. We'll see how many angry NFT owners.
Yeah, I think in-game currency is probably, I want to say, favorite. I'm not an advocate for money laundering at all, but I think like there are certain kinds of crime that they take a lot of skill to pull off, and they're a bit of an art form. And in-game currency, or if you compromise someone's Blizzard account and then sell all of their gold on Warcraft for real money, that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting field, and I think it's one of those things where it's difficult, right? Like, successfully laundering money is difficult, and it must be because there's so many stories of people getting it wrong. Either they made mistakes when they were new, so when they're first starting out with criminal activities, they make mistakes that get them caught in the future, or, they're maybe really good at hacking, but not necessarily really good at, the actual money laundering aspects, those kinds of things. Or maybe there's also examples where groups get together, the groups trust each other, and then one of them sells them out for whatever reason. They fall out, or maybe one gets caught and then there's a plea deal and those kinds of things. I think I want to kind of bring in here the story that I was talking to you about earlier, in terms of just like really good example of some crypto theft from an exchange that led down a really difficult example of money laundering. And how, whilst you might watch movies, you might read books about money laundering, there's a lot of criminals out there who, it turns out, are just not very good at it.
I want to hear the story. I've heard it already, but I want to hear it again because it was hilarious.
So this is the story of Ilya Dutch, Lichtenstein, and Heather Morgan, who I will just summarize as saying both very interesting characters for various reasons. And they were recently charged with money laundering. The beginning of this story, there's some details missing from this story, but they were charged with laundering the money that was stolen from Bitfinex. The reason that I word it like that is so far, they have not actually been charged with hacking Bitfinex. It's just that they came into possession of the funds, and then they have been laundering the funds. And it's a huge figure. So when Bitfinex were originally compromised, 119,754 Bitcoins was stolen, which at the time, this is 2016, was about $71 million. Another way of putting that was 0.75% of all Bitcoin in circulation. So a huge, huge amount of coins. But of course, over the years, that has increased greatly in value. And when I was writing the show notes a couple of weeks ago, I took a look at what the value was, and it was $5.2 billion. So this has slowly been increasing, but it's a huge amount of money that they had in their possession as cryptocurrency that it is alleged, tried to launder so that they could access those funds and use them illegitimately. This is the biggest law enforcement seizure of all time. The law enforcement were able to seize 94,636 of the Bitcoins, which at the time of the seizure was valued at $3.6 billion. So it's just a crazy amount of money. But the story is interesting not only because a huge amount of Bitcoin in terms of value was stolen, that Bitcoin was then seized by law enforcement. But it's interesting just because of the difficulty that the two suspects had in actually laundering the money. For one thing, some of their activities did tip off private industry organizations. So when they were trying to access the funds, for example, they were bumping into crypto exchanges' know your customer processes. So some of the crypto exchanges were asking them about the sources of these funds, and they were giving either no answers. So when they were challenged, they would simply just not use that account anymore and the account would be frozen. Or they would come up with some story which was not believed or was not detailed enough for the crypto exchange. So saying things like the cryptocurrency was previously gifted to them and they'd been holding them in cold storage and those kinds of things. Things that we now know are not true. It's alleged that law enforcement can demonstrate these funds came from the Bitfinex breach, right? Because they can track those transactions through the blockchain. They did take actions to obfuscate the sources. They use layering, where they are moving the funds between a large number of crypto wallets, and they were allegedly doing that using automated software. So they're not just moving it by hand, the same amount of money, not just like drag and drop 3.6 billion worth of crypto from one wallet to another. They were doing multiple transactions between multiple wallets of varying values. This activity we would call layering, and it's a money laundering technique. And one of the things that occurred from that is they therefore had a large number of crypto wallets that had some funds in. So they needed a way of tracking not only the wallets where the funds were, but they were tracking, of course, if some of those funds had been frozen. They were tracking those. And they also had to keep track of the passwords, or in this context, it would, of course, be private keys for those crypto wallets. So it is alleged that Dutch did the only sensible thing you would do if you had a whole bunch of passwords you needed to track. He kept them in a spreadsheet on his cloud storage. And law enforcement, as part of their investigation, gained a search warrant for the cloud storage. It is said that law enforcement were able to decrypt these files. It's not said in the documentation that I've read how that was possible, but they were able to decrypt these files. And they were therefore able to access this spreadsheet of all of the Bitcoin addresses and all of the private keys. And that was how they were able to seize the funds, was they just had access to those wallets so they could transfer the money out. So this is, calling back to earlier of, even if you don't tell the person that they're under suspicion of money laundering and their account has been frozen, if you go into the bank and the teller says, sorry, there's a hold on your account, we can't process this transaction at this time, that might tip you off that the funds have been frozen. Imagine when Dutch looked into his account and all of his funds had gone, that might have been an indicator that they were onto him.
That's actually really interesting, though, because there's some pieces of legislation and there's some quirks in how you're able to obtain evidence for things like that. And I think when you're looking at e-crime or digital fraud, the Computer Misuse Act and how you obtain evidence in digital forensics is a really difficult thing to navigate. So I'm wondering how they achieve that. I'd like to know more about that. Maybe we can cover that in like a digital forensics episode.
We could also no doubt talk a little bit about how search warrants work for electronic systems and those kinds of things, how law enforcement are able to lawfully access these things. And we could maybe talk about balancing that against privacy rights as well. There's a lot to be said about things like law enforcement's access to messenger platforms. Foreshadowing for a future episode there.
We also need a whole episode to discuss the myriad ways in which Microsoft Excel has served humanity.
It's the second best tool. It doesn't matter what you're doing, it is the second best tool.
It's the best password manager. It's the best place to store all your crypto keys.
Yeah.
Sold.
So far in the story, we know that Dutch and Heather had access to these funds that are alleged to have come from the Bitfinex breach. We know that it is alleged that they attempted to launder those through layering, through obfuscating, where the source of those funds was. But the last step that we haven't talked about is this integration step, right? Of once you've done the layering, you've obfuscated the source of those funds. How do you get it so that you can actually access them? So how do you turn illegitimately gained cryptocurrency into cash or some other mechanism that you can use? So you've talked about things earlier. You mentioned, using gift cards and those kinds of things. And maybe that's one activity, using the crypto to buy gift cards and then buying things with the gift cards, those kinds of things. In this particular instance, it is alleged what Dutch did was he used the crypto funds with an exchange that allowed you to purchase gold and then had the gold sent to an address that he had access to. So, of course, that is one mechanism for turning the crypto funds into a source of currency, a form of currency that you could then, sell and use to buy products and services. The problem is the exchange that they used, allegedly, they signed up for using their actual email address and validated it with their actual driving license, and then had the gold sent to their actual home address.
That's incredible.
Yes.
Incredible.
So, tracking that down was relatively easy. And of course, you might say that, oh, well, if you're doing these activities, you need to worry about OPSEC, operational security, and effectively protecting the privacy. If you're the criminal, you need to make sure that law enforcement can't track you. And, we're talking about like fake IDs, fake passports, making it so that your communications between your co-conspirators are protected from law enforcement. And of course, it's alleged that Dutch also performed some of those actions. For example, when they searched his apartment, they found a bag labeled burner phones. That's one thing. And also, on the cloud storage, there was other files. For example, a file giving ideas for where they could get other passports from and those kinds of things. So, I mean, it's pretty nice of them to, have a folder on their cloud storage called passport ideas and a bag in their apartment called burner phones. If you're going to get law enforcement searching your apartment, I mean, neatly categorizing the evidence for them is only polite.
Yeah, it's like when you check out of an Airbnb and you take the sheets off, right?
When
Good
you check out of
vibes.
an Airbnb, you take the sheets.
You take the sheets off.
Well, just like in all of the light bulbs, just like,
Oh my god.
just like, that's a nice throw pillow. I might keep it.
You leave the sheets on, don't you? Oh my goodness.
I don't say an Airbnb, so that's the problem that we're coming up against here.
The funniest part about all of this for me is, what did he think he was going to be able to do with the gold?
To be clear, that gold is not the only thing that they bought. There was some gift cards. Gift cards were used to purchase things like PlayStation and that kind of thing. So they did gain access to some of the funds. A huge amount of the funds was frozen. Something like $180,000 was restricted by the crypto exchanges. Not necessarily because of a specific suspicion, but because, like I say, they had difficulty with the Know Your Customer protocols because they couldn't validate or chose not to validate the accounts. The exchanges therefore locked those accounts by default until a validation process was followed through. So that did cause them some problems. And honestly, by reading it, it just sounds like they had a real difficult time with these anti-money laundering and know your customer protocols. And it may have just been the case that, on one hand, maybe they made some mistakes. They made those mistakes when they were less knowledgeable of the processes. Or maybe it was frustration that they couldn't access these funds. They've got a bank account here with $4 billion in it and they can't get to it.
Well, in fairness, it didn't have $4 billion in when they committed the crime. It was only, tens of millions.
I mean, as far as we know, they didn't commit the crime. We just know it is alleged that they had access to the funds. It could be that someone else, an associate or somebody else, actually did the Bitfinex breach, and then maybe they themselves could not access the funds. This is one of the things when it comes to cybercrime in general. if you have some technical skill, but not skill through things like money laundering, as a cyber criminal, maybe you just sell that service, right? So you hear things like ransomware as a service and those kinds of things. Maybe you just sell a capability. So whilst it is true that at this time they've not been charged with the Bitfinex breach itself, it could literally be that they just did not commit that crime. They were just given the funds through some other means.
I've been studying cybercrime recently as part of my master's degree, and something that comes up quite often and that they reiterate to you throughout the module is that it's easier to prosecute fraud than it is to prosecute cybercrime because attribution is more difficult. And there's also less maturity in the regulation around cybercrime. So there are interpretation quirks. And because it's also such a difficult thing for lay people to understand, it's easier to induce doubt into the minds of like a potential jury whether a crime was actually committed or the person in question committed the crime, whereas fraud is much easier and more widely understood, so it's easier to prove.
And the actual charges that they have against them is laundering of monetary instruments, fraud by wire, radio, or television, and conspiracy to commit offence or to defraud the United States. So they are being charged effectively with the laundering of the money, not at this time at least with the actual original breach of Bitfinex.
I think the volumes in terms of money laundering and potential fraud that they've committed there, though, do they really need to be charged with the attack itself, the breach itself on top of that? I think like the sentence is going to be pretty huge given the volume of cryptocurrency involved.
This is like a societal and like moral question, isn't it? Does it matter if they are charged with all of the offences that they committed, or does it matter that they're appropriately punished? It depends entirely on how you feel about crime in general, and should prison be a punishment or should it be aiming for rehabilitation and all of those kinds of things. I think there's like a massive moral hole you could fall down there in terms of like, should we aim for charges that are easy to get through the courts, or should we aim for the charges that most accurately reflect the crimes committed and those kinds of things? And I think this podcast is maybe not the right place to have that kind of moral discussion. And instead, we should maybe just close out with a fantastic summary of this particular case that I saw by Matt Levine, who's a Bloomberg columnist. And I think he really summed up this case really quite accurately. He said, if you rob a bank and steal a sack of money and the bills are sequentially numbered and a die pack explodes in the sack and you drive directly to another bank and hand them the die-stained sack and say, I'd like to make a deposit, please, you will totally get arrested and you will probably be charged with money laundering, but in no meaningful sense did you launder the money. It still has die on it. That happened here.
Yeah, I think people often make the mistake of thinking that cryptocurrency is perfect for money laundering. But that is, I think, largely due to a lack of understanding around the technology and also this impression that it's not at all regulated. It still has to be regulated to an extent because it still touches the legitimate financial system.
You could argue here what does regulation mean and those kinds of things, but yeah, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of people out there who are committing these crimes and they are being successfully charged with those actions. So I think the first thing is don't confuse Bitcoin, or I guess more accurately the blockchain, being decentralized with it being anonymous or untraceable. It is definitely not that. There are anonymity enhanced currencies out there, but money laundering it's a difficult topic. And even when you take away things like these people making basic mistakes like using their actual ID, using their actual home address, all of those kinds of things, it turns out that anti-money laundering and know your customer protocols can work.
But I think on the other side, like, as an industry, the finance sector has a long way to go in terms of maturity. I always think it's funny when people report at the end of a financial year on statistics and on criminal statistics and things like that. And they'll say that there was like £0 of successful fraud. I've seen a stat before, it was £0 of successful mortgage fraud in a financial year. Like, if it was successful, would you have detected it? That's meaningless to me because I don't think that you have the maturity or the capability to detect it if it's successful and it's well executed. And I think actually we have a gap as a security industry in testing fraud detection systems. So we might approach things in the way that we approach penetration testing or site reliability engineering or something like that, where we test the confidentiality, integrity, availability of information systems. But are we testing fraud detection processes and anti-money laundering processes? How easy is it to circumvent those? And I suppose it sort of falls into fraud adjacent social engineering type work. But I think that there's a lot that we could do in that space. I'm really interested to see how it evolves over the next decade or so.
There's a big thing there to be said as well about just like statistics in general. I operate obviously on the cybersecurity side of things more than the financial side of things, but I see a huge number of statistics within cybersecurity that are just wrong, incomplete, or intentionally misleading. I'll give you an example from this week. I saw a statistic that said, and I quote, phishing attacks increased from 72% to 83% in the last 12 months. What does that mean? Did the efficacy of phishing increase? Did the number of threat groups utilizing phishing increase? Did the number of phishing emails sent increase? The number of companies targeted increased? What increased? But we see these statistics all the time.
Yeah. I would interpret that as business compromise originating from phishing emails, or where you can attribute the origin to a phishing email has increased from like 72 to 80 whatever percent. Like that's what I would assume that meant.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to mean that, right? So one of the things that I
No.
see very often in the context of phishing emails is people saying the frequency of phishing attacks is increasing. Um, that doesn't necessarily matter. It might with phishing, but certainly with other attacks, it might not. For example, if password guessing attacks are increasing, but your organization effectively defends against password guessing attacks, you've got multi-factor authentication. Let's not worry about the details for now. Something like that. You have a protection that mitigates the risk of password guessing attacks. It doesn't matter how frequent they are if you effectively defend against them. So the statistic can become meaningless. You can also hide some things. So in the same article, I saw another example of details getting like conflated. So the article said 47.3% of emails sent or received are spam emails. And then I saw another article citing that original source saying almost half of emails sent in 2021 were phishing. Now, spam email and phishing email are not synonymous.
Yeah. I think there's probably another episode in there where we talk about things like phishing simulations internally, awareness campaigns, and so on.
We definitely need to talk about phishing simulations because there's so many cybersecurity professionals out there who, based on their experience or based on their bias, will say a certain defensive mechanism should be used without backing that up with data. And like I'm seeing research that suggests that active phishing campaigns against your own staff can in some instances be actively damaging. But we still see it constantly advocated for. In the same way that we still have organizations enforcing things like password rotation, that is arbitrarily changing passwords after a number of days, even though there's so much research that says that it's actively damaging for defense.
I think it's in keeping with outdated regulation or standards that haven't been updated, though. So I think best practice is typically to follow things like NCSC guidance or NIST guidance, depending on a given security control, but that might not always be appropriate for your organization. So I think like being too prescriptive with like global security controls is a flaw. And that's like something that I would like to explore more widely in a different episode. But I don't think that you can just set it and leave it and forget about it with security. You need to constantly review your controls and make sure that they're still appropriate as your organization evolves and as the industry evolves and the behavior of the sorts of threat actors and attacks that you're seeing evolves.
There's that side of it as well, but there's also just technology improves and things become better. And even if you're using a control because it effectively mitigates a risk, maybe there is a similar but different control that will offer the same level of protection, but it's maybe easier to use for your staff and those kinds of things. So you should constantly review those things, not only from a security point of view, but just like for other reasons, operational excellence.
A high-level UN panel estimated that annual money laundering flows globally are at $1.6 trillion, or about 2.7% of global GDP in 2020. I'll add the source for that into the show notes because I know that you love stats.
I actually do love data-driven arguments. What I hate is people misrepresenting statistics, doing things like conflating spam and phishing. They're different words, they're not synonymous. So yeah, I'm not against statistics. Please don't interpret that as me being against statistics. I'm against statistics being used for the benefit of lying.
And secondly, we've just talked about money laundering for about an hour and a half. What is your favorite money laundering mechanism?
I'm not recommending money laundering, though. Can we just close this episode out by saying that in that particular case, they're facing charges with a maximum sentence of up to 25 years imprisonment.
That's pretty wild. Also, not advocating money laundering. I just think it's really interesting.